Audiobook, The Cuba Case and the Stockholm Syndrome. By Milco Baute. Written and published in 2019. Introduction. As I usually do in my books and articles, I will approach this topic from a spiritual perspective, discerning what has happened to Cuba for more than 60 years. Cuba has had to endure a communist dictatorship with no end in sight, no visible change or transition that could give its people hope of recovering their freedom and returning to civilization with democracy and rights like any other civilized country in the world. The economic and social model chosen by the Cuban government when Fidel Castro took power after Fulgencio Batista fled the island on December 31, 1958, leading to his overthrow and the triumph of the Cuban rebels' revolution led by the Castros, was socialism. Although apparently, this was not the revolution's original idea according to some of its leaders like Frank Pace, Hubert Matos, and others, the goal of that armed revolution was to liberate Cuba from a repressive and dictatorial regime, leading it to democracy, not to a Marxist-Leninist-style communist dictatorship as had been established in Russia in the early 20th century after World War I. However, Castro's mind was not solely set on liberating Cuba from Batista's regime, he craved power. To prolong or eternalize his political power, he needed to ally with a military superpower like the Soviet Union. Fidel Castro deceived revolutionary leaders, his followers, his people, and the entire world by declaring that he was not a communist when he took political power in January 1959. He not only deceived but also betrayed and murdered anyone who opposed him or was an obstacle. Socialism is a failed system that did not work in a superpower and the world's largest country, the Soviet Union, which experimented with it for 70 years without achieving first world status. On the contrary, many died of famine. It was even less likely to work on an island with 10 million inhabitants and few resources like Cuba, and much less under a Castro-style communist dictatorship. If Castro or the Cuban revolutionaries had allied with the United States, or better yet, had annexed or united as another state with their capitalist neighbor, the island of Cuba would have continued to prosper as it did in the past when it was considered the pearl of the Antilles, a prosperous, developing country second only to the U.S. and Canada in the Americas. Today, it is undoubtedly the poorest country in Latin America, continuing to decline economically, morally, and culturally. Logically, what has not worked for 60 years will never work in a modern, civilized world if the same model and government are maintained without democracy, freedoms, and rights. Hawaii is an island in the Pacific Ocean, about 4,000 kilometers from the U.S. coast. At the end of the 18th century, it was annexed to the United States as the 51st state, with barely 1.5 million inhabitants. Although Hawaii does not produce much, it is today the best state in the nation, with a higher quality of life, more prosperity, and greater security. If we were to see Cuba united with the U.S., one day, I assure you it would be much more prosperous than Hawaii, which only has about 10,931 square miles compared to Cuba's 42,426 square miles and 10 times the population, with many more natural resources. It would be a radical change that could occur in less than 10 years. Cuba would not lose its identity or sovereignty because Hawaii has not lost its own, maintaining its language, customs, culture, and traditions. For many, it is considered a paradise. This would be like a younger sibling seeking the protection of an older sibling, in this case, the neighbor. It is like a small company merging with a large corporation to function better and obtain greater benefits for both, so everyone wins. Another example I could mention is the State of Israel, with less than 14 million inhabitants, located in a volatile region surrounded by hostile countries that hate it and want to see it disappear, driven by envy and religious extremism. Israel is the most prosperous state in the Middle East, a free and sovereign nation that relies on the protection of its older sibling, the United States, even though it is far from the American continent. Israel could not have survived without the protection, unconditional support, and mutual cooperation of the U.S., which God has used and continues to use to care for his people. Although God shows no favoritism, he fulfills his promises, especially the one made to Abraham, the father of the Jews and the Christian faith. Because salvation comes from the Jews, through Jesus, the Son of God, the incarnate Word, God has protected Israel despite its enemies' attempts to exterminate it. The devil, our common enemy, has always tried to thwart God's plans and the Creator's order. If one day Cuba achieves a democratic, multi-party transition and a party with annexationist or unionist ideas wins the elections and makes a proposal to a conservative party in the U.S. at that time, I believe we could at least achieve Cuba becoming like Puerto Rico, an associated state, if the U.S. is not interested in acquiring it as another state. While many believe no U.S. party is interested in Cuba, the truth is the U.S. does not benefit from having a communist dictatorship so close in the Caribbean. Although it may not pose an immediate threat, it is a danger to the continent's political and economic stability, at least for right-wing conservatives like the Republican Party. The U.S. would try to prevent another dictatorship from forming after Cuba achieves freedom through a peaceful democratic transition, knowing that Iran, Russia, and China have interests in the region due to its proximity to the U.S. and its strategic location. These three nations are nuclear powers, not just U.S. competitors but treacherous enemies who, while not openly waging war against the U.S., seek to undermine and secretly conspire against it. Certainly, the U.S. would consider and support the Cuban people in this because they would not want to repeat the history of the October crisis, which sparked the Cold War, bringing us to the brink of a nuclear World War III. However, this is very difficult to achieve, not because the U.S. doesn't want it, but because Cubans don't want it, even though many would. Cubans on the island and many outside it are content slaves. They think they only need material goods, small businesses, and the ability to travel to boast and feel important. Cubans have lost their sense of freedom and have no idea what dignity is. They believe life is all about dressing up, partying, drinking, and eating well. Patriotic Cubans are becoming extinct, and those who risk fighting for Cuba's freedom, inside and outside the island, peacefully denouncing the regime's abuses and demanding their rights, are admirable but unfortunately a minority. Most Cubans suffer from Stockholm Syndrome. Even outside Cuba, they are persecuted and enslaved by the regime, fearing to speak out, denounce, or even acknowledge the truth about Cuba's abuses, repression, lack of freedoms and rights, and the misery its people endure, dependent on the crumbs from their rulers and especially from family or friends abroad. Cubans simply do not want to be free, they are not interested in democracy or independence. They prefer to continue depending on the government, not just those in Cuba but also those who flee or are exiled abroad, since every Cuban who leaves the island is an exile, although not all are political refugees. They also seek to live off foreign governments under the pretense of being refugees, taking advantage of political asylum laws when, in truth, they are active or passive collaborators, consciously or unconsciously, of the Cuban regime. When people get used to evil, there comes a time when they end up accepting and even praising it. From my book Reflections of Milco Baute. Many Cubans deserve to be free, independent, and prosperous without needing to compromise with the regime that oppresses, limits, and controls them, but honestly, they are fewer every day. They are an unfortunate minority born in the wrong place or at the wrong time. But destiny is not born, it is made. That's why I left Cuba, seeking lands of freedom to change my misfortune and destiny, to give my family and descendants a better future. But I will never forget where I came from or the suffering of those left behind. I don't get irritated or lament as others do, instead, I prefer to pray and speak out, to love and not hate, to have hope and not doubt that nothing is impossible for God. Just as history changes often, ours can change, but we are responsible for making that change. I hope this raises awareness so that those who are participants and accomplices stop being so, reconcile with God, whether they believe in Him or not, and start praying. Just as the Hebrews cried out to God for 430 years in Egypt to be freed from Pharaoh's slavery, we Cubans, especially God's children, must pray for our land, our identity, and our rights. God will never lift us out of misery as long as we maintain an attitude of conformity, dependence on man, and fear. Cubans can be free, but praying, crying out, and fasting are useless if we remain silent and complacent, consciously or unconsciously complicit with that regime. Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological reaction in which a victim of kidnapping or involuntary detention develops a relationship of complicity and a strong emotional bond with their captor. This is primarily due to the misinterpretation of the absence of violence as an act of humanity by the aggressor. According to data from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, around 27% of victims from 4,700 cases of kidnappings and sieges in their database experience this reaction. Victims who experience the syndrome regularly show two types of reactions to the situation. On one hand, they have positive feelings towards their captors. On the other hand, they display fear and anger towards law enforcement authorities or anyone opposing their captors. Additionally, the captors themselves often develop positive feelings towards the hostages. It is worth noting that Stockholm Syndrome is not recognized by the two most important psychiatric manuals, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, and the International Classification of Diseases, ICD. Therefore, this syndrome falls under the category of post-traumatic effects. Causes. Several possible causes for such behavior are mentioned in the literature on the subject. Both the hostage or victim and the perpetrator aim to come out of the incident unharmed, hence they cooperate. Hostages try to protect themselves in uncontrollable situations by attempting to fulfill their captor's wishes. Perpetrators present themselves as benefactors to the hostages to prevent an escalation of events. This can lead to an emotional bond of gratitude from the victims towards the criminals. Based on personal development history, the victim's closeness to the criminals can be seen as a reaction developed during childhood. A child who perceives a parent's anger suffers and tries to behave well to avoid the situation. This reflex can reactivate in extreme situations. The total loss of control experienced by a hostage during a kidnapping is hard to assimilate. It becomes more bearable for the victim by convincing themselves that it has some meaning, which can lead them to identify with the criminal's motives. This behavior arises due to the psychological pressure the hostage feels from being isolated, abandoned, threatened, and perhaps forgotten by the police. History. On August 23, 1973, Jan-Erik Olsson attempted to rob a creditbanken in Stockholm, Sweden. After being cornered, he took 4 bank employees hostage, 3 women and 1 man. Among his demands was the release of Clark Olofsson, a criminal serving a sentence at the time. Despite threats to their lives, including being forced to stand with nooses around their necks, the hostages ended up protecting the captor to prevent him from being attacked by the Stockholm police. During captivity, one hostage stated, "I'm not afraid of Clark or his partner, I'm afraid of the police." After her release, another hostage, Kristen and Mark, declared, "I trust him completely, I would travel the world with him." Psychiatrist Nils Bejerot, an advisor to the Swedish police during the assault, coined the term Stockholm Syndrome to refer to the hostages' reaction to their captivity. A year later, in February 1974, Patricia Hearst, granddaughter of magnate William Randolph Hearst, was kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army. 2 months after her release, she joined her captors, helping them rob a bank. This case popularized the term Stockholm Syndrome, as her defense attempted to use it during the trial, but it was not accepted by the court, and Hearst was convicted for the robbery. In 1904, Catalan writer Marian Vereda, 1853–1903, described this psychological effect in his novel La Puñalada. Situations. According to psychiatrist and professor of social medicine Nils Bejerot, who advised the Swedish police during the kidnapping, Stockholm Syndrome is more common among people who have been victims of some form of abuse, such as hostages, victims of domestic violence, members of a cult, victims of repeated sexual abuse, prisoners of war, concentration camp prisoners, victims of intimate partner violence. Other uses. Outside the criminal context, Stockholm Syndrome can occur in basic military training, a mildly traumatic experience, with the goal of creating bonds within military units that will remain loyal even in life-threatening situations. Similarly, the effects of hazing in group initiations, such as fraternities, secret societies, gangs, and brotherhoods, have been compared to this syndrome. In cultural anthropology, a common similar symptom is bride capture. Loyalty to an abusive, more powerful figure, despite the danger this loyalty poses to the abuse victims common among victims of domestic abuse, maltreated individuals, and child abuse victims, dependent infants. In many cases, victims choose to remain loyal to their abusers and opt not to leave, even when offered a safe place in foster homes or shelters. This syndrome was described by psychoanalysts from the Object Relations Theory School, see Ronald Fairbairn, as the phenomenon of psychological identification with the powerful abuser. Domestic Stockholm Syndrome. Domestic Stockholm Syndrome, DSS, also known as battered woman or man syndrome, occurs in individuals abused by their intimate partners with whom they maintain an emotional bond. DSS suggests that the victims of partner abuse adapt to the aversive situation, increasing their ability to cope with adverse stimuli and minimize pain. These individuals often exhibit cognitive distortions such as dissociation, denial, or minimization. This allows them to endure the violent situations and incidents inflicted upon them. Origin of the term. The term is linked to Stockholm Syndrome, defined after a specific incident where, following a bank robbery in Stockholm, a teller fell in love with one of the robbers. Sandor Ferenczi, 1873–1933, called this defense mechanism identification with the aggressor, a bond created when someone feels powerless against their aggressor in a life-threatening situation. It is a survival mechanism developed by abuse victims to coexist with the repeated violence inflicted by their partner. This mental process in the victim's mind is also referred to as domestic Stockholm Syndrome. It was formulated by Lenore Walker in the United States in 1979 to describe the psychological aftermath experienced by women subjected to gender-based violence. The formulation of this syndrome is based on the theory of helplessness learned. This theory is grounded in experiments conducted by Martin Seligman, which also influenced the analysis of human depression. The author studied dogs subjected to intermittent electric shocks. These shocks were randomly administered and the dogs approached their food. This procedure led the dogs to develop a behavior where they would corner themselves in a safe corner of their cage. They remained in that corner until deciding to search for food again, sometimes receiving shocks and sometimes not. This process created feelings of uncertainty and increased dependency on the experimenter. As a result, a parallel was drawn between the learned behavior developed by these dogs and the behavior of abused women. Some critical perspectives argue that the uncertainty associated with repeated, intermittent violence is key to developing the bond, but it is not the sole factor. Classification as unspecified dissociative disorder. The syndrome in question has not been characterized as a diagnostic entity in the latest 1995 edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-4, but it is recognized as a psychopathological phenomenon with a traumatic foundation, in which the victim is induced into a mental model of a cognitive nature and contextual anchoring. Montero Gomez, 1999. Montero has classified this syndrome under the category of unspecified dissociative disorders in the DSM-4. The author has described domestic Stockholm Syndrome, DSS, as an interpersonal protective bond constructed between the woman and her aggressor within a traumatic environment with restricted stimuli, through the induction in the woman of a mental model, an intersituational network of mental schemas and beliefs. The woman subjected to abuse would develop Stockholm Syndrome to protect her own psychological integrity and restore physiological and behavioral homeostasis. Montero Gomez, 1999. According to Dutton and Painter, 1981, Stockholm Syndrome in the domestic sphere arises in a specific way. These authors described a scenario where two factors, the power imbalance and the suspension of the good-bad treatment dynamic, generate a traumatic bond in the abused woman, linking her to the aggressor through submissive behaviors. Here, abuse creates and maintains a dynamic dependency within the couple due to its asymmetric effect on the balance of punishments. This feeling of dependency leads to identification with the aggressor, the justification of their actions, and ultimately, taking their side. Although the adjective, domestic, is sometimes understood as referring to the family living space, in domestic Stockholm Syndrome, it refers to much more than just the household where the couple may live together. Abusive behavior often occurs at home, but it also happens outside of it. Therefore, it is important not to confuse the term domestic when discussing this syndrome, DSS. It is noteworthy that victims often exhibit cognitive distortions such as dissociation, denial, or minimization prior to the traumatic event. This syndrome can occur in both men and women. Phases. The syndrome is determined by a series of changes and adaptations that occur through a process consisting of 4 psychological phases in the abuse victim. Trigger phase: the initial abuse shatters the sense of security and trust that the victim had in their partner. This results in disorientation, loss of reference points, and even depression. Reorientation phase: the victim seeks new reference points, but their isolation becomes increasingly severe. At this stage, the victim is usually left almost entirely alone, with support limited to a close family. The victim lacks comparative perspectives due to isolation. Coping phase: the victim perceives reality in a distorted way, blames themselves for the situation, and enters a state of helplessness and passive resistance. The abuser makes them feel guilty. The victim adopts their partner's mental model, attempting to manage the traumatic situation. Adaptation phase: the victim projects the blame onto others or external factors, external locus of control. Domestic Stockholm Syndrome becomes consolidated through a process of identification with the aggressor. Regarding this topic, Vallejo Rubinstein notes that the lack of awareness of these processes and their consequences often leads to abused women being treated and portrayed as masochistic, crazy, or hysterical individuals who enjoy being beaten. As Rojas Marcos explains, when analyzing representations of victims and aggressors, especially in media portrayals that rarely consider or narrate these processes, women are often depicted much worse than their abusers. The abuser is typically presented as a normal person, someone who was never violent according to neighbors and witnesses, not the monster one might expect, whereas the woman is shown as unhinged and out of control, supposedly provoking the abuse with her behavior. 1995, page 34. This pathological conception of abused women is just one of the many images or stereotypes circulating in society regarding victims and abusers. The Cuba case and the Stockholm Syndrome. The case of Cuba represents a political version of Stockholm Syndrome, as the people have become so accustomed to their captor and oppressor that they cannot imagine living any other way. The Cuban people were kidnapped by the Castros and their rebel terrorists from the July 26 movement after being promised what they were never given, gradually stripped of what they had, and forced to depend on limited, ration supplies. The regime manipulated laws at will, constantly playing with the people, making them believe that basic necessities had to be earned rather than simply acquired when needed. After 6 decades of captivity, torture, and humiliation, the population came to believe this narrative. Castro learned well from his model and mentor, Stalin, who demonstrated this metaphor about how to control people. During one of his meetings, Stalin, Soviet dictator, 1878 to 1953, requested a chicken. He held it firmly with one hand and began plucking its feathers with the other. The chicken, desperate for pain, tried to escape but couldn't. Once he had plucked all its feathers, Stalin told his aides, "Now watch what happens." He placed the chicken on the floor, moved a little away from it, and held out a handful of grain. The aides watched in astonishment as the terrified, bleeding chicken followed Stalin around, eager to eat the grain he scattered. Stalin then turned to his aides and said, "This is how easy it is to govern fools. Did you see how the chicken followed me despite the pain I caused it? This is how most people pursue their rulers and politicians despite the suffering inflicted upon them, simply for the sake of receiving cheap gifts or a bit of food for a day or two. Authoritarian governments prefer citizens who are lax, numb, and, above all, perpetually dependent on fabricated needs. This is so true that colonial agendas always prioritized the creation of artificial needs, maintaining a perpetual state of dependency that only the conqueror could fulfill. During my nearly 30 years living in Cuba, 1967 to 1995, we were made to believe that Cuba was a paradise of justice and equality. Despite facing many hardships and limitations, we were convinced that we were better off than most countries and that any shortcomings were the fault of the cruel U.S. empire. We were taught to depend solely on the humanitarian socialist government of Fidel Castro, the olive-green Messiah and Savior. We were indoctrinated to worship his personality and follow him like a god. Castro himself declared, "With the revolution, everything, without the revolution, nothing," echoing the biblical words of Jesus, "Whoever is not with me is against me." Even today, after his death, he continues to be followed and adored. This is how an authoritarian, tyrannical regime operates. First, they deify themselves, supported by socialist propaganda filled with lies and false promises. They then consolidate power by unifying state institutions, manipulating laws to their advantage, establishing a dictatorship, and repressing anyone who opposes or thinks differently. They distribute crumbs at their convenience, binding the population to their ideology and rewarding loyalists. People learn to behave like pets, always following their master regardless of mistreatment, simply because they receive scraps of food. For this reason, not even God can intervene, as the population allows their rulers to abuse them. In my opinion, God has shown great mercy to the Cuban people despite everything, because instead of worshipping the true God, they chose to follow and idolize men, plunging into idolatry, Santeria, witchcraft, and voodoo, making Afro-Cuban religion their official faith. Most Cubans believe in orishas or Catholicism, both pagan and idolatrous religions, although many have turned to the true God, choosing to follow Christ, not the Christ of organized religion but the Christ of the Bible, the Word of God. God gave Cubans a lesson, allowing them to endure a long and painful period of trial to bring them back to Him. He has not failed them, as He is performing miracles and wonders on the island, and souls are being saved. If they still suffer under a seemingly endless dictatorship, it's because God knows the right time for everything. In ancient times, monarchs, pharaohs, kings, and emperors enslaved and mistreated others for hundreds of years. Now, modern dictatorships are the new pharaohs of our era. This doesn't mean Cuba will have to wait hundreds of years, but I fear it will take more time. The regime will persist, changing only its faces, until the people learn to depend solely on God, the Creator, and repent from their abominations. Why, then, do we not see uprisings or mass protests in Cuba as in many other countries? Why hasn't something like what happened in Italy with Mussolini, Romania with Ceausescu, or more recently Egypt with Mubarak and Libya with Gaddafi occurred? Not even the current situations in Venezuela or Nicaragua compare. The answer is that Cubans have grown accustomed to their misery, to the crumbs from their masters and foreign relatives, to being treated as fourth-class citizens, unable to speak freely without repression, and having no independent voice. They don't care if their country falls apart, indeed, it already has, with crumbling cities and collapsing buildings. They are indifferent to whether a Castro or Diaz-Canel is in power. What matters to them is partying, gossiping, receiving remittances from abroad to survive or buy goods unaffordable with their meager incomes, or topping up their cell phones. Cubans abroad are often just as complicit. Many work tirelessly only to support those left behind, visiting the island twice a year to flaunt their material goods. The proof lies in the recent constitutional reforms, which the population accepted without protest, or worse, praised, without understanding the implications. They are being handed eternal Castroism without even realizing it because they simply do not care. The rest of the world doesn't stand in solidarity with the few opposition members and dissidents who risk their lives daily in Cuba because even fellow Cubans do not support them. Instead, they criticize, betray, and persecute them, committed to the system and the revolution to maintain their jobs, benefits, or crumbs. The world remains indifferent because it observes the behavior of Cubans both inside and outside the island. In the 70s and 80s, perhaps until the mid-90s, Cuban exiles denounced the tyranny internationally. Now, they are part of the system, eager to return after a few months abroad, leaving all their hard-earned money in the regime's coffers. They sustain the dictatorship with their labor, acting as modern slaves. This complicity is why Cuba remains unchanged, with no improvements or divine intervention. They are, knowingly or not, the ones perpetuating the dictatorship. Some Cubans abroad even dare to blame the so-called U.S. blockade for their misery, parroting socialist propaganda that blames others for their failures. In reality, the only blockade in Cuba is the one imposed by the Castro government against its own people. Hunger and poverty are communist strategies to control minds, fostering submission by forcing people to focus solely on daily survival rather than the future. This prevents them from organizing, preparing, protesting, or dissenting. They are stripped of freedom of speech, assembly, and religion unless it aligns with the regime. Although Christianity has gained more freedom since Pope John Paul II's visit in the 90s, the Christian church remains heavily restricted. The government fears competition and potential counter-revolution activities, labeling anything that doesn't fit the Castroist system as such. They know that Christianity brings spiritual awakening and intellectual freedom, removing the fear of rulers and oppressors, which threatens a dictatorship built on fear and idolization of men and ideology. For nearly 30 years, no one even mentioned the economic embargo against Cuba because the island depended on the Soviet Union, its sponsor and best ally. By the 80s, we spoke Russian, ate Russian food, and wore Russian clothes. The cultural influence was so strong it nearly replaced our own. But when communism fell in Russia and the socialist bloc in Europe collapsed, the regime began blaming the economic embargo imposed in the 60s after the government expropriated American businesses without shame. That was the embargo's sole purpose, to seek justice and punish the tyrant. Though the embargo has done little, as American products are still sold in Cuba through third parties, it has been the regime's primary excuse since the 90s to justify ongoing misery, hunger, persecution, and lack of rights. In 2003, I traveled to Java, Indonesia, a slightly larger island than Cuba with nearly 14 times the population. Despite being a poor, developing, tropical country like Cuba, Java is not plagued by misery, repression, or a lack of rights. Indonesia enjoys freedom of expression, assembly, and religion, with the world's three largest religions coexisting, Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. It's a democratic country with the rule of law. People are free to trade, buy, sell, and earn a living. Even the poorest earn about $5 daily, while in Cuba, the average monthly income barely reaches that. Cuba is an extreme case, beyond common sense or logic. Anyone who supports, defends, or condones the longest dictatorship in history is as complicit and guilty as the regime itself, according to Romans 1:32 and Isaiah 10:1-3. Let those who read, understand. The 70 years of Cuba's curse. I do not intend to prophesy or claim to be a prophet, but in my opinion and that of other colleagues and scholars on the subject, the case of Cuba is not coincidental, nor the work of fate, but rather a warning or curse from the God of Israel and the Church of Christ, for having been a curse to the Jewish people during a time when they deserved mercy. This was not only during one historical occasion, such as during the Nazi persecution, but also since Castro came to power, Cuba has consistently criticized and participated in demoralizing the State of Israel and the Jewish people internationally. When 937 Jewish refugees set sail aboard the transatlantic ship St. Louis bound for Havana from the German port of Hamburg on May 13, 1939, they thought the journey would finally free them from Nazi persecution. However, for many, the voyage was doomed before departure due to the strong anti-immigrant sentiment prevailing on the island at that time. The vast majority of the refugees never disembarked, and despite crossing the Atlantic, many ultimately perished in European concentration camps after being forced to return to Germany. God promised Abraham, the father of the Jews and the father of faith in Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Since then, Cuba has not had a government that was not oppressive and repressive. The Cuban people have suffered for many years because that was only the beginning. Cuba has condemned Israel at the United Nations since 1959. According to experts and modern prophets, God destined Cuba to suffer for 70 years, of which 60 have already passed. Venezuela is experiencing a similar case. Remember when Chavez publicly cursed the state of Israel on television, saying he cursed it from his very core, only to soon develop a fatal cancer that led to his death. Venezuela also condemns Israel annually at the United Nations, and all countries that have done so without shame have faced the consequences. Their misfortune and misery have been swift. A Venezuelan prophet predicted and conveyed a message to Hugo Chavez, calling him to repentance, foretelling he would govern for 14 years. Chavez ignored the warning and openly mocked God. This prophet, whom I personally met, told Chavez in 2009 that he had 9 years left to govern, which completed his 14 years in power. No one has yet revealed how long Venezuela will endure a Castro-Chavista communist dictatorship, now over 20 years old. What is certain is that nations suffer the consequences of their poor choices, wicked leaders, and their rejection of God, as they worship idols, whether men or images, mainly due to ignorance. But I tell you that everyone will have to give account on the day of judgment for every empty word they have spoken. Matthew 12:36. Woe to the sinful nation, a people whose guilt is great, a brood of evildoers, children given to corruption. They have forsaken the Lord, they have spurned the Holy One of Israel and turned their backs on him. Why should you be beaten any more? Why do you persist in rebellion? Your whole head is injured, your whole heart afflicted. From the sole of your foot to the top of your head there is no soundness, only wounds and welts and open sores, not cleansed or bandaged or soothed with olive oil. Your country is desolate, your cities burned with fire, your fields are being stripped by foreigners right before you, laid waste as when overthrown by strangers. Daughter Zion is left like a shelter in a vineyard, like a hut in a cucumber field, like a city under siege. If the Lord Almighty had not left us some survivors, we would have become like Sodom, we would have been like Gomorrah. Isaiah 1:4-9. If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. 2 Chronicles 7:14. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my priests, because you have ignored the law of your God, I also will ignore your children. Hosea 4:6. Cuba U.S. Cultural Exchange. I ask the promoters and supporters of the cultural exchange policy between Cuba and the United States, what exactly is being exchanged? Musicians for money, or for lifting the economic embargo? The government in Havana sends us musicians and artists of all kinds, in exchange for what? What is the supposed exchange? For an exchange to exist, there must be an agreement where both parties benefit. If it's cultural, I imagine there should be no discrimination against artists. Yet according to Cuban artists, the promoters of this cultural exchange, and all the nostalgic Cubans living in the U.S. eager to see their favorite island artists, politics and art are separate. They claim they are not political and do not engage in politics, they just want to perform for Cuban audiences in exile. And that would be fine if it were true. But we all know that art in Cuba is politicized. To succeed, especially to travel abroad, an artist must be ideologically committed to the Cuban system, or at least not openly opposed or indifferent to the political order established by the Cuban government for decades. In fact, these Cuban musicians who travel abroad must be ready to defend their socialist revolution or, at the very least, refrain from speaking against it if pressured. Otherwise, their privileges would end. All jobs, professions, and occupations held by Cubans on the island are paid by the government. The government pays and distributes wages, whether they work for national or foreign companies. The self-employed are merely individuals trying to survive, not practicing government-funded professions. If a self-employed person travels abroad, they cover their own travel expenses, or rely on foreign relatives or friends to do so. I know artists and ordinary Cuban citizens who have traveled abroad, but these cases have nothing to do with the so-called cultural exchange. They are talented individuals who, through personal effort and external support, have fulfilled their dream of traveling to visit friends and family or showcase their art internationally. These cultural exchange artists are government pawns. Their trips are not self-funded but financed by the Cuban government or those promoting this exchange, which is nothing more than an attempt to ease decades of tension between both countries. So, don't claim you're not involved in politics, because you are. Don't criticize or insult the Cuban exile community, who have the decency and dignity to oppose these relations, nor play the victim. The real victims are Cuban exiles separated from family just 90 miles away, deprived of their right as Cuban-born citizens to travel to their homeland freely, own property on the island, or recover property confiscated by the Castro regime simply for living abroad, especially in the U.S. This approach, which began during the Obama administration, shows that political leftism has a unified mindset, regardless of its branch, ideology, doctrine, or intensity. Politicizing art is an old leftist strategy, just like they politicize the press, media, and entertainment industry, including sports. We experienced this in Cuba, those of us born and raised there, and we continue to see it in the U.S., especially since 2008, with the leftist shift under Obama, who unmasked the Democratic Party. Despite conservative efforts to restore America's principles, values, power, and morality, the damage remains, particularly regarding the sanctions against a dictatorial regime that has enslaved its people for over 60 years. Don't call us political opportunists or Trump lackeys. The real opportunists are those who sell out, participating in this disgrace. For 60 years, many have lost their lives, been tortured in prisons, lost family members, some never knowing their whereabouts. Many lost their properties, childhoods, and families, never reuniting even to bury loved ones because they were denied entry to their own homeland. Cultural exchange does not exist because many talented Cuban artists in exile cannot travel to Cuba. The regime won't allow it unless they support the communist system. Artists like Amari Gutierrez, Willie Chirino, Albita Rodriguez, Gloria Estefan, John Secada, Andy Garcia, and many others refuse to visit an enslaved Cuba out of dignity and honor for those who have suffered for 6 decades. Celia Cruz never saw her homeland again and was practically exiled without being a dissident or political figure. Don't play the victims, the real victims, refusing to participate in your hypocrisy in genuinely loving our suffering homeland, which we long to see free. We are neither accomplices nor participants in the abuse and evil. We know right from wrong and reject cultural nostalgia, even as we take pride in being Cuban, cherishing our culture, roots, and beautiful island, which was seized by evil forces that installed instruments of oppression in power. Long live free Cuba, and God bless America. Types of Cubans outside Cuba. The patriot longs for Cuba's freedom. Rejects injustice and the evil of its oppressors and their supporters. The communist, loyal to the Castro revolution until death, no matter where they are. The unaware communist, complicit in the dictatorship, defending and supporting it unknowingly. The nostalgic, another unintentional accomplice of the dictatorship, always praising Cuba while criticizing the country that welcomed them. The carefree, indifferent, focused solely on eating, drinking, partying, and flaunting wealth in Cuba. The politically resentful, wants nothing to do with Cuba. Hates the homeland and even fellow Cubans. The future slavery, José Martí, 1884. The trend toward socialism in current governments, the excessive action of the state, housing for the poor, nationalization of land, bureaucracy. The Future Slavery is the title of this treatise by Herbert Spencer. That future slavery, which Spencer studies from the perspective of a Greek citizen who cared little for the lower classes, is socialism. English literature remains lofty and lordly, this disdain and nobility, which granted originality in character, deprive it, however, of the more desirable universal influence on which it would be entitled by the depth of its thought and its melodious form. Those who do not communicate at the altar of humanity are just unknown by it. How will socialism manifest, and how is it to be a new form of slavery? Spencer views the growing victories of socialist ideas and the weak concessions of popularity-seeking politicians as precisely the trends that, if properly addressed, would render socialism unnecessary. These trends are born from the noble intentions of generous thinkers who see that the just discontent of the working classes drives them to desire radical and violent reforms. These thinkers find no more natural way to cure the root of the problem than to remove the causes of discontent. However, this must be done in such a way that the relief of the poor does not encourage idleness. Laws intended to alleviate hardship should aim to prevent revolt by addressing its causes, not by merely pacifying the discontented. Under the pretense of aiding the poor, says Spencer, so many taxes are imposed that those who were not poor become impoverished. The law that established parish-based poor relief increased the number of the poor. The law that provided a premium for mothers of illegitimate children led men to prefer such women as wives because they came with a dowry in the form of that premium. If the poor become accustomed to relying entirely on the state, they will soon cease making any effort for their own subsistence, unless the state provides them with jobs. Already, the poor receive aid in countless forms. Now there is a demand for the government to build housing for them. It is argued that just as the government owns the telegraph and the postal service, it should own the railroads. Spencer believes that the day the state becomes a builder, construction will decrease as private builders lose profitability, leaving the state as the sole constructor. Though this argument comes from a formidable thinker, it is not entirely solid. Similarly, Spencer argues that if the state owns the railroads, it will usurp all related industries and compete with the diverse multitude of private entrepreneurs. Yet this reasoning also falters, as railroad companies are few and already manage their own materials. Spencer views all these state interventions as results of rising tides of public demand, imposed by the masses. He fails to acknowledge that the commendable and sensible desire to provide clean housing, which benefits both body and mind, originated within cultured circles, without any unworthy intent to court popular favor. The proposal to nationalize railroads, despite its drawbacks, has lofty moral objectives, such as reducing corrupt stock market speculation. These reforms are supported in various countries by people far removed from taverns and slums. Spencer fears, not without reason, that as the state's role becomes increasingly varied, active, and dominant, it will impose considerable burdens on the working population for the benefit of the impoverished. Indeed, if benevolence reached the point where the poor no longer needed to work to live, which they never will, the drive for individual initiative would weaken, and the burden on the wealthy would increase without satisfying the endless needs of those without wealth. He also fears the proliferation of additional laws required to regulate previous poor relief laws. But this arises from the attempt to legislate the symptoms of poverty rather than addressing its root causes, which lie in the filth, decay, and degradation in which the lower classes of large cities live. Clean, artistic, bright, and airy housing can significantly alleviate this misery without driving higher-end builders from the market or causing the exaggerated risks Spencer suggests. Providing affordable housing simply means offering good homes at the same price people currently pay for squalid shacks. Spencer constructs his bleak vision of the future on these firm foundations, bolstered by the exaggerated demands of radicals and the Democratic Federation in English politics. He compares this vision to pre-conquest Peru and post-Roman Gaul, where citizens received everything from the state in exchange for labor rendered to the state. Henry George advocated for land to become national property, and the Democratic Federation desired the formation of industrial and agricultural armies led by the state. Increasing taxes to meet new demands will render low-yield lands unproductive, reducing national output since all wealth ultimately comes from the land, necessitating state-organized forced cultivation. Such enterprises would dramatically increase the already excessive number of public employees. Every new function would create a new class of bureaucrats. In England, as elsewhere, public office is overly coveted, seen as more prestigious than other jobs, offering generous and secure pay for relatively little work, clearly sapping the nation's vitality. A nation dominated by office workers is in trouble. The growing power of bureaucrats, united by the need to maintain their privileged, lucrative positions, would diminish the people's influence, as the general public lacks the shared interests that bind officials together. With the state satisfying all public needs, officials would gain enormous influence as distributors of rights and benefits. The individual who now wants the state to care for them to avoid self-reliance would then be forced to work as, when, and where the state dictates. The state, burdened with all responsibilities, would naturally acquire all the powers necessary to fulfill them. Man would transition from being a servant of himself to a servant of the state. From being a so-called slave to capitalists, he would become a slave to bureaucrats. A slave is anyone who works for another who has control over them. In a socialist system, the community would dominate the individual, to whom all labor would be surrendered. Since bureaucrats are human, thus prone to abuse, arrogance, and ambition, and would wield great power supported by those who benefit from or hope to exploit their abuses, as well as by the base forces that oppression, prestige, or cunning always purchase among the oppressed, this system of official labor distribution would soon suffer from the corruption, violence, theft, and distortions that individuality, authority, genius, and vice inevitably introduce into all human institutions. From bad humanity, says Spencer, no good institutions can be made. Thus, under the socialism toward which England seems to be heading, public misery would be palpable and widespread. Autocratic bureaucracy would exploit the weary working class, and servitude would be both lamentable and universal. Throughout this study, Herbert Spencer outlines the potential consequences of concentrating functions within the state, leading to this painful and diminished form of slavery. However, he does not equally emphasize the natural means of balancing public wealth, which is so inhumanely distributed in England that it naturally fosters anger, despair, and hopelessness among those starving in the streets, while others, with the annual income from their properties, could cover all of England in gold. We would say to politics, err, but console. For one who consoles never truly errs. New York, April 1884. Taken from Complete Works, Volume 15, Editorial de Ciencias Sociales, Havana, 1975, pages 388 to 392. The History of an Oppressive Revolution. I conclude this book with the history of that oppressive revolution, which, far from evolving, regresses, and for 6 decades various crimes, injustices, murders, disappearances, imprisonments, deprivations, betrayals, misery, and moral, cultural, and historical distortion have been committed. Cubans have lost their essence and have become conscious and happy slaves, doing what their oppressors have wanted and staying silent to avoid losing privileges, getting into trouble, or being barred from visiting the island. Since I am not a historian and did not live before or at the beginning of that revolution, not even for the past 25 years, which is approximately when I left Cuba until now, and I have not visited the island again, I cannot argue, verify, or confirm what has happened beyond the 28 years I lived in Cuba from the 1970s to the mid-1990s. But if I were to write a book about the abuses and crimes committed in Cuba, the miseries, tragedies, and hardships of the Cuban people, I would have to write an encyclopedia. However, in this case, and only for those who do not know the history of our people, or those who have forgotten it, I share in this closing of the book an article from the virtual encyclopedia Wikipedia, which does not represent my opinion or point of view but that of the historian and author and the revealed references. History of the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution is the primary result of the Cuban leftist revolutionary movement that led to the fall of dictator Fulgencio Batista's regime and the rise to power of the guerrilla army leader, Fidel Castro. Since the revolutionaries have remained in power ever since the revolution is considered to span from the uprising against Batista to the present day. Background. After the reformist and autonomous tendencies of notable Creole thinkers such as José de la Luz y Caballero and Félix Varela, the most progressive thinkers of the 19th century concluded that only Cuba's independence could vindicate its population. Despite warnings from Cuban autonomists, Rafael Montoro, Domingo del Monte, and Spanish politicians and military figures like Praxedes Mateo Sagasta and Arsenio Martinez Campos about the usefulness of Cuba's autonomous status to avoid losing it entirely, the government of Canovas pursued a stubborn and bureaucratic policy of extortion and extremism with the Caribbean island. After the failure of the 10 Years' War, 1868 to 1878, Cuban revolutionary thought became more refined, with a much deeper philosophical, ideological, and social foundation, thanks to the thinking and organizational actions of José Martí, who dedicated virtually his entire adult life to the struggle for independence. Martí created the Cuban Revolutionary Party, PRC, in New York to unite Cubans with the same ideals and veterans of the 10 Years' War. After many conflicts and failed attempts, the necessary war, as Martí called the War of Independence, finally began on February 24, 1895. In 1898, with Spanish power increasingly confined to a few urban centers and the war clearly favoring the insurgents, the United States, under President William McKinley, ordered military intervention in the conflict, undoubtedly hastening Spain's total defeat in a war it had already lost. The U.S. Congress announced the Teller Amendment, declaring the U.S. had no interest in annexing Cuba upon its independence from Spain. Martí, who had long warned of the danger posed by the United States to Cuba and the rest of Latin America, had fallen in battle on May 19, 1895. On December 7, 1896, Lieutenant General Antonio Maceo, the other revolutionary leader and warrior, also died in combat. General-in-Chief Máximo Gómez, the undisputed military leader of the 1895 revolution, did not feel authorized, due to his Dominican origin, to lead Cuba's destiny and prevent what was happening before his eyes. After the U.S. victory over Spain, the U.S. quickly established its dominance over Cuba. It introduced the Platt Amendment, imposed on the nascent Cuban constitution, granting the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuba whenever deemed necessary. The U.S. also seized the military base in Guantanamo, which it still occupies illegally, and created the legal and economic foundations for total control over Cuba's economy and properties, while denying Cubans the full enjoyment of the independence from Spain to which they were entitled. Revolutionary Communist Party. Fulgencio Batista, President of Cuba, in front of a map of Cuba pointing to the Sierra Maestra, where Fidel Castro had been hiding since 1956, preparing the coup against the Cuban government. The triumph of the October Revolution in 1917 in Russia and the spread of socialist and social democratic ideals in Europe and Latin America led to the creation of Cuba's first Communist Party, initially founded by Carlos Bolino, a founder of the PRC and acquaintance of Martí, and Julio Antonio Mella, great-nephew of Matias Ramón Mella, father of the Dominican homeland, in 1925. Mella was a great organizer, university leader, notable trade unionist, and labor activist who led numerous protests, both written and in the streets, against the governments of the time. After going into exile in 1926, he continued his activism in Mexico, gaining continental prominence for his clear ideas regarding political struggle. In 1929, he was mysteriously assassinated in Mexico, with ongoing debate over whether his murder was ordered by Gerardo Machado or Stalin. Even so, Machado attended his funeral, offering condolences and remarking, "He was a good person, but a communist," earning him the label, "Donkey with Claws," from communist leader and poet Rubén Martínez Villena. After Mella's death, the Revolution of 1930, led by the ailing Villena, toppled Machado's dictatorship, but the opposition's rise to power never materialized. After a period dubbed the Youthocracy, and Mangonio, by Raúl Roa Garcia, later the first foreign minister of the Cuban Revolution and longtime anti-imperialist activist, and after several presidents whose names are now almost forgotten on the island, power passed to the Pentarchy, followed by the 100 Days government triumvirate. This period saw the alternation of three different forces, the consistent, revolutionary, and popular anti-imperialism of Antonio Guterres Holmes, the hesitant, inconsistent politics of Ramón Grau San Martín, and the silent but threatening opposition of Fulgencio Batista, who rose to power after the military sergeants' revolt supported by the ABC organization. Batista also maintained constant contact with the U.S. Embassy, led by Jefferson Caffery, whom Guterres bluntly told to stick to his diplomatic functions. During this period, the Cuban Communist Party was legalized. Guterres, perhaps the most consistent Cuban revolutionary of the 1930s, was a staunch enemy of the Cuban Communist Party of that era, whose most notable figure was Juan Maranello, an excellent writer and union organizer but an apologist for Stalinist-style organization, which Guterres strongly opposed due to the known atrocities of Stalin. Nevertheless, in his intense role as Secretary of the Interior, Guterres legalized communist activities and clashed violently with Batista over the repression they faced more than once. Besides repressing protests and labor strikes during this period, Batista ultimately orchestrated Guterres's assassination in Matanzas, along with Carlos Aponte, as Guterres attempted to go into exile to organize an insurrection from abroad. After a brief, seemingly constitutional period, the new 1940 constitution was one of the world's most advanced, had it been fully implemented, supported by the good neighbor policy promoted by U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Batista, facing the radicalization of new revolutionaries and his evident unpopularity against other presidential candidates, secured the support of the U.S. Embassy before taking more radical action. Immediate political origins of the Cuban Revolution. On March 10, 1952, a coup d'état led by Fulgencio Batista easily and without resistance overthrew the elected President Carlos Prio Socarrás of the Authentic Party, in an international context marked by the early stages of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Constitutional guarantees were immediately suspended, and a strong military dictatorship was established. 2 years later, rigged presidential elections were held, with the results known in advance. Batista's justification was the fight against corruption and gangsterism, but in reality, it was to seize power and enrich himself and his close allies. The continuation of the scandalous level of corruption that characterized the Republican period, coupled with the enrichment of an increasingly reduced oligarchy, which significantly affected the emerging Cuban middle class, led to the formation of widespread opposition in favor of insurrection to oust Batista from power. Numerous political parties, labor unions, the student movement, and even sectors of the business community identified with this opposition. During the first 2 years, 1952–54, even the United States appeared to take a stance against Batista's dictatorial violence, limiting military supplies. The deposed president, Carlos Prio Socarrás, a politician who never exposed himself to the risks of concrete action, expressed this revolutionary climate by stating, "I will triumph by any means, even the most extreme." Flag of the July 26 movement, created in 1955 by a group of Cuban nationalists, with Fidel Castro as a prominent figure. In this context, a group of young people broke away from the main body of the Cuban People's Party, Orthodox Party, very popular and considered the virtual winner of the 1952 elections that were prevented by Batista's coup. They distinguished themselves from the rest through their decision to resort to armed struggle if necessary to overthrow the Batista regime. This group of young people, who called themselves the Centennial Generation, because their movement coincided with the centenary of José Martí's birth in 1853, organized militarily. Led by Fidel Castro, on July 26, 1953, they attempted to seize the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba and the Carlos Manuel de Céspedes barracks in Bayamo. The attempt failed, resulting in dozens of deaths. The military government responded with harsh repression, leading to the arrest and public trial of Fidel Castro and other attackers. After 22 months in prison, since the death penalty did not exist in Cuba, on the Isle of Pines, and under growing popular and international pressure along with several insurrection attempts, Castro and his comrades were granted amnesty by Batista in 1955. A few days later, Fidel Castro founded the clandestine July 26 movement, M26-7. At that time, shortly after the onset of the Cold War and as a legacy of McCarthyism, the accusation of communism became widespread in Latin America as a tactic to discredit and repress democratic and social movements. Juan José Arevalo would later warn about this mechanism in his book Anti-Communism in Latin America, 1959. On July 7, Fidel Castro traveled to Mexico to prepare a guerrilla group with which to return to Cuba and begin the armed struggle. While in exile, Castro established contacts and agreements with other groups favoring armed struggle to overthrow the dictator. These groups represented a wide range of ideologies, including the Revolutionary Directorate led by José Antonio Echeverría, composed of University of Havana students, former President Carlos Prio Socarrás of the Authentic Party, and the Revolutionary National Action, ANR, led by Frank Pace. Even a sector of the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, supported the armed struggle against Batista and, through Carlos Prio, financed the initiation of the guerrilla movement that Fidel Castro was organizing. The armed struggle. On November 25, 1956, the yacht Granma set sail from Tuxpan, Veracruz, Mexico, carrying 82 guerrilla fighters from the July 26 movement, including Fidel Castro, Juan Manuel Márquez, Fausto Obdulio González, Raúl Castro, Juan Almeida Bosque, Camilo Cienfuegos, and the Argentine Ernesto Che Guevara. Guevara had joined the guerrilla movement after fleeing repression following the overthrow of the Democratic Popular Government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. After 7 days of stormy navigation, the Granma ran aground in the mangroves of Playa Las Coloradas near the municipality of Niquero, then in Orient Province, now Granma Province, on the eastern coast of Cuba on December 2, 1956. The landing had been planned for November 30, coinciding with a popular uprising in Santiago de Cuba organized by Frank Pace to support the guerrillas. The delay prevented the success of this coordination, which was intended to distract Batista's army forces and facilitate the guerrillas' landing. In contrast, Batista's Cuban army consisted of 80,000 soldiers. Scattered, disoriented, and pursued, the expeditionaries suffered a serious initial defeat at Alegría de Pio. As a result, only about 20 men, out of the original 82, managed to make their way into the Sierra Maestra, a remote, rugged region in eastern Cuba, where they managed to establish a foothold. After the bombing at Alegría de Pio and the subsequent execution of several expedition members, Batista's government spread the false news that Fidel Castro and all the expeditionaries had been killed. This disheartened many revolutionaries across the country, but in the following weeks, the situation began to change. 1957. January 16, the guerrilla fighters, under the leadership of Fidel Castro, carried out their first military action, attacking and capturing the small military outpost of La Plata. February 17, an interview with Fidel Castro, conducted by Herbert Matthews in the Sierra Maestra, was published in the New York Times, the most widely read newspaper in the United States. March 13, the Revolutionary Directorate attacked the presidential palace and temporarily seized the Radio Reloj broadcasting station. During the operation, their leader, José Antonio Echeverría, president of the Federation of University Students, FEU, and extremely popular, was killed. May 28, Battle of El Lluvero, the first open combat action of the M26-7 guerrilla forces. July 12, Fidel Castro, Raúl Chibas, and Felipe Pazos signed the Sierra Maestra Manifesto. July 17, the second column of the rebel army was created, known as Column No. 4, commanded by Che Guevara. July 30, the treacherous assassination of Frank Pace took place in Santiago de Cuba, triggering a popular uprising and shifting public opinion decisively against Batista's regime. Frank Pace, a Baptist pastor, had serious disagreements with Raúl Castro and Che Guevara. September 5, a revolt erupted at the Cienfuegos naval base, led by Ensign Dionisio San Roman, with support from militia members of the Authentic Party and the July 26 movement. The government responded with brutal repression, including the bombing of the base by Batista's Air Force. Many of the 400 rebels perished, and San Roman died after being tortured. Throughout this year, cells of the July 26 movement expanded to almost every major city and town in the country, carrying out protests, acts of sabotage, and executions of regime henchmen and informants, chivatos, across the island. 1958. At the beginning of 1958, the rebel army, bolstered by new recruits from the M26-7 and local peasants, continued securing victories in Orient Province. On January 16, they triumphed in Veguitas, and between February 16 and 17, they won the Battle of Pino del Agua, consolidating their control over areas in the foothills of the Sierra Maestra. In this region, they established a solid logistical base, including a radio station launched on February 24. On February 23, in Havana, rebels kidnapped the race car driver Juan Manuel Fangio, who was scheduled to participate in a sports event organized by Batista. On March 6, the rebels achieved another victory in the Battle of Estrada Palma. From this point, the guerrilla forces began engaging in more mobile warfare, evolving into a semi-regular army. March 26, the U.S. government, pressured by public opinion, imposed an arms embargo on Batista's regime, citing violations of the Mutual Defense Assistance Agreement. This agreement prohibited the Cuban government from using U.S.-supplied resources for internal repression. However, Batista sought alternative arms suppliers from the UK, Belgium, Israel, and the Dominican Republic. The U.S. struggled to find a satisfactory third option between Batista and Castro, viewing elections as the only feasible path forward. February 27, Fidel Castro decided to expand guerrilla operations, creating 3 new columns under the command of Juan Almeida, Raúl Castro, and Camilo Cienfuegos. Almeida was assigned to the eastern Sierra Maestra, while Raúl Castro opened a second front in the Sierra Cristal, north of Santiago. April 9, a revolutionary general strike, called by the July 26 movement, failed due to poor planning and lack of support, and was swiftly crushed by the government. May 6, Batista's troops launched a general offensive in the Sierra Maestra to destroy Castro's guerrillas. Major battles ensued, including El Jigue and Santo Domingo. After a defensive phase where rebels were confined to strongholds like Pico Turquina, El Hombrito, La Bayamiza, and Malverde, Batista's army retreated, suffering heavy casualties and demoralization, followed closely by a successful counteroffensive rebel. August 7, Batista ordered a mass withdrawal from the Sierra Maestra, exposing the regime's weakness. Fidel Castro then decided to spread the war to the rest of Cuba. Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos were sent to central Cuba to divide the island and prepare for an attack on Santa Clara, the gateway to Havana. Fidel and Raúl Castro remained in the east to maintain control and eventually attack Santiago de Cuba. August 31, the columns led by Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos began their westward march on foot. It took 6 weeks to cross the swampy southern coasts of Camagüey and Sancti Spiritus before reaching the Escambray Mountains, specifically Caballito de Casa in the former province of Las Villas. September-October, once established in central Cuba, the July 26 movement coordinated with other guerrilla groups in the region, such as the Revolutionary Directorate, the Second National Front of the Escambray, and the Popular Socialist Party, Communist, organizing logistical support. In the east, rebel forces controlled much of the plains and surrounded major cities. November 3, rigged presidential elections were held, but no political force recognized their legitimacy. November 20 to 30, Battle of Gaisa. Late November, the government attempted an offensive against guerrilla positions in the Escambray. December 4, troops commanded by Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos launched an offensive, attacking government regiments in central Cuba to isolate Batista's forces. By the end of December 1958, Batista's dictatorship was nearing collapse. On December 28, militias led by Che Guevara launched the decisive attack on Santa Clara, the key to central Cuba and the last stronghold before Havana. On December 31, after the rebels captured an armored train sent by the government to reinforce Santa Clara, Batista decided to flee to Santo Domingo with the elected President Andrés Rivero Aguero, leaving the country virtually leaderless under General Eulogio Cantillo. Following a meeting between Fidel Castro and General Cantillo, an attempt was made to establish a military junta in Havana, initially under Magistrate Orlando Piedra and later under Colonel Ramon Barcan, who had been imprisoned for conspiring against Batista. Castro rejected this maneuver, calling for a general strike with the slogan, "Revolution, yes, coup d'état, no," and ordered Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos to continue advancing towards Havana and seize key positions in the capital. January 1, 1959. In the early hours, troops from the Second National Front of the Escambre, led by Eloy Gutierrez Manoyo, entered Havana. The next day, forces from the July 26 movement, commanded by Camilo Cienfuegos and Che Guevara, arrived, taking Campo Colombia military base and the fortress of San Carlos de la Cabana without resistance. Upon entering Campo Colombia, Cienfuegos dismissed Colonel Barcan and arrested General Cantillo. Shortly after, the Revolutionary Directorate, led by Four Common, occupied the presidential palace, causing tensions among revolutionary factions. Simultaneously, on January 1, Fidel Castro triumphantly entered Santiago de Cuba, declaring it the provisional capital of Cuba and proclaiming Judge Manuel Urrutia Leo as the president of the nation. For the time being, the U.S. recognized the revolutionary government. From that moment, power remained firmly in the hands of the revolutionary forces. Historically, the triumph of the Cuban Revolution is marked on January 1, 1959. American journalist Jules Du Bois described Batista's regime. The reprisals of Batista's repressive forces cost the lives of numerous political prisoners. For every bomb that exploded, 2 prisoners were taken from jail and summarily executed. One night in Marianao, a neighborhood of Havana, the bodies of 98 political prisoners, riddled with bullets, were scattered through the streets. The revolution in power. Che Guevara with Manuel Urrutia in 1959, who served as president at the beginning of the revolution after being appointed by the rebels. Once in power, the guerrilla fighters formed a new government. The president was Manuel Urrutia Leo, and the prime minister was José Miró Cardona. The ministers were Regino Bodi, Economy, Rufo López Fresquet, Finance, Roberto Agremont, Foreign Affairs, Armando Hart, Education, Enrique Altusky, Communications, Luis Orlando Rodriguez, Interior, Osvaldo Dorticos Tirado, Revolutionary Laws, Manuel Rey, Public Works, Faustino Perez, and Ernesto Guevara, Industry and Recovery of Embezzled Assets. Fidel Castro remained as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Revolutionary trials. One of the new government's first decisions was to initiate revolutionary trials as part of the process known as the Commission of Purification against individuals considered war criminals or closely associated with Batista's regime. Later, this extended to new opponents, such as Jesus Carreras Zayas, commander of the Second National Front of the Escambre, who was accused of supporting a rebellion in 1960. Between January and April 1959, around 1,000 individuals were denounced and tried in summary trials, with 550 of them executed by firing squad. Ernesto Guevara, in his role as head of La Cabana Fortress during the early months of the revolution, oversaw the trials and executions of detainees there. Guevara publicly expressed his stance on these executions at the United Nations on December 11, 1964. We must say here what is a well-known truth, which we have always expressed to the world: executions, yes, we have executed, we execute, and we will continue to execute as long as necessary. Our struggle is a fight to the death. We know what the outcome would be if we lost, and the worms must also know the outcome of losing the battle today in Cuba. In January 1959, attorney José Villasuso began working under Guevara in the Commission of Purification as an investigator. According to some critics of the regime, he described the firing squad wall stained with the blood of individuals without incriminating evidence and denied the right to a fair defense. Reports claim that hundreds of men were similarly sentenced to death through predetermined judgments in these summary trials. Executions soon spread throughout the island. Resignation of Urrutia and Fidel's rise. Due to disagreements with Urrutia over the implementation of certain popular measures, Fidel Castro publicly resigned as prime minister. This led to massive citizen demonstrations demanding his return, which forced Urrutia to step down. Osvaldo Dorticos was appointed the new president, with Fidel Castro reinstated as prime minister. Expropriations and nationalizations. On May 17, 1959, Fidel Castro signed the promised agrarian reform law in the Sierra Maestra. The National Institute of Agrarian Reform (INRA) was established, becoming the center of Cuban state power. A process of expropriations, nationalizations, and confiscation of ill-gotten assets began, significantly affecting the upper class and some U.S. companies, as well as businesses from other countries. Simultaneously, moderate figures in the government, Miró Cardona, Urrutia, López Fresquet, were gradually replaced. Almost the entire upper class, including plantation and sugar mill owners, along with a significant sector of the middle class, left the country, settling in the United States. They joined many officials from Batista's government who had previously emigrated, taking millions of dollars from the Cuban treasury. The Cuban government also began arresting mafia leaders and seizing millions in cash. Before his death, Meyer Lansky remarked that Cuba had ruined him. According to mafia historian Enrique Cirillo, Cuba is the only country where the mafia experienced such a rapid downfall. Controversy over holding elections. Before their victory, Fidel Castro and other revolutionary leaders drafted the Sierra Maestra Manifesto, in which they committed to holding general elections for all state, provincial, and municipal offices within a year under the rules of the 1940 Constitution and the 1943 Electoral Code, and immediately transferring power to the elected candidate. Despite promising elections within 18 months, the government abandoned this commitment after the revolution's triumph, arguing that previous governments had been corrupt, served U.S. interests, and were detrimental to the Cuban people. It wasn't until June 30, 1974, that the first elections were held in Cuba. Since then, elections have been held regularly, though critics consider them fraudulent. For example, the President of the Republic is not elected by direct popular vote but through the National Assembly. Opposition within the revolutionaries. In July 1959, Huber Matos publicly denounced the direction the revolution was taking, delivering anti-communist speeches in Camagüey. This led to disputes with Prime Minister Fidel Castro and President Manuel Urrutia Leal. In September 1959, Matos wrote, "The communist influence in the government has continued to grow. I must leave power as soon as possible. I have to alert the Cuban people about what is happening." Humberto Sory Marin, 1915–1961, was a commander in the July 26 movement, later serving as Minister of Agriculture and author of Cuba's agrarian reform laws. After the law's enactment, he resigned and joined a subversive campaign to reduce communist influence in the government. He traveled to the U.S., where he received instructions to carry out terrorist attacks in Cuba. He was arrested with weapons and explosives, along with 4 companions, in Selomar after arriving by boat from the U.S. Shortly after the Bay of Pigs invasion, he was executed by firing squad. Insurrection derived from the Dominican Republic. After Fidel Castro's revolution triumphed on January 1, 1959, a group of exiled Dominican leaders saw an opportunity to invade the Dominican Republic and overthrow the dictatorship of Rafael Leonidas Trujillo. They immediately received support from the then undeclared communist Cuban regime and, to a lesser extent, from Venezuela's democratically elected president, Romulo Betancourt, who was a staunch enemy of Trujillo due to an assassination attempt organized against him. The group began training in Pinar del Rio, with recruitment happening almost publicly in Cuba, Venezuela, the U.S., and other countries. The military command was led by Commander Enrique Jiménez Moya, a Dominican who had joined the guerrillas fighting Batista in the Sierra Maestra in December 1958 after arriving from Venezuela. Interestingly, Dr. Manuel Urrutia was also on that flight, briefly visiting the rebels. On June 14, the first contingent of about 50 men departed from Cuba on a plane painted to resemble a Trujillo Air Force aircraft. They landed in the afternoon at the Constanza military airport. After a brief skirmish with confused soldiers from the airbase, Jimenez Moya and his men retreated into the nearby mountains. This action was supposed to coincide with the landing of 2 additional groups by boat at different points in the Dominican Republic, but due to various reasons, this didn't occur until 6 days later. On June 20, the remaining expeditionaries left Cuba, with one group landing at Estero Hondo and the other at Mayman. Both groups were ambushed by Trujillo's army, many were killed, and the survivors retreated to the mountains. Another contingent remained in Cuba and did not participate in the invasion. Pursued by the army, the rebels were gradually captured or killed. By the end of June, the invasion was virtually annihilated. On July 4, Trujillo declared victory. Today, the martyrs of the June 14 movement are remembered in Santo Domingo as the immortal race. Measures taken by the United States. Propaganda poster celebrating the Bay of Pigs victory. On April 15, 1961, planes piloted by Cuban exiles bombed Cuban airfields as a prelude to the landing at Playa Girón, in the Bay of Pigs. The Argentine journalist Rodolfo Walsh, who managed to decode a message from the U.S. military, warned the Cuban government of the impending invasion. The invasion was crushed within 65 hours by the rebel army and militias. Almost the entire invading brigade surrendered and was later exchanged for food and baby food. In the final hours of the invasion, President John F. Kennedy, who had inherited the plan from Dwight D. Eisenhower, did not authorize a direct invasion of Cuba. Later, in February 1962, Kennedy signed the decree imposing an economic and commercial embargo on Cuba. This measure remains in effect today, reinforced by U.S. laws such as the Torricelli Act, 1992, and the Helms-Burton Act, 1996. Since 1988, the United Nations General Assembly has repeatedly voted against the measure, condemning the U.S. embargo on Cuba, which is not a bilateral embargo since it affects third countries. Dissolution of the Soviet Union. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, some international political analysts predicted the imminent fall of the Cuban government. It was believed that, faced with the global triumph of capitalism and Western democracy, the commercial embargo and the subsequent deterioration of living conditions would inevitably trigger a popular uprising on the island. However, these predictions did not come to pass. Special period. This period, known as the special period in peacetime, refers to the era in Cuban history following the dissolution of the USSR until the new millennium. In fact, the special period began on September 1, 1990, with strict food controls, as food was almost entirely rationed to prevent widespread famine. However, it's important to note that basic food items had been rationed since the early days of the revolutionary government through a food ration book system with significant subsidies. The loss of 85% of Cuba's external market due to the collapse of the socialist bloc plunged the country into a deep crisis. Despite this, the Cuban government decided to host the planned 11 Pan-American Games in Havana. The U.S. argued that the Games should be relocated due to Cuba's crisis, suggesting they be held in the U.S. or another country in the region. Ultimately, hosting the Games resulted in more expenses than benefits, as Cuba refused foreign broadcasters and even provided free television coverage to poorer nations. The enormous costs of the Pan-American Games accelerated the impending economic collapse. Between 1992 and 1994, the national budget was reduced to less than $2 billion annually, a low figure for a nation of 11 million people. Inevitably, diseases related to malnutrition began to appear, including vitamin deficiency neuropathies such as optic neuritis. Facing economic collapse, the government authorized a limited private sector known as quenapropismo, or self-employment, which was the only sector capable of providing services and artisanal functions that the state could not sustain at the time. Later, as the national budget strengthened, self-employment was drastically restricted through bans on new licenses and increased taxes. Simultaneously, in 1993, the government legalized the possession and use of foreign currencies, particularly the U.S. dollar. This was accompanied by measures like Casas del Oro and foreign currency stores, which significantly improved the exchange rate of the national currency. However, workers' wages remained unrealistically low, entirely disconnected from prices and basic family needs. Additionally, alongside the opening to tourism, there was a sharp rise in prostitution and pimping. Economic recovery to the present. The government implemented measures to recover from the crisis, including increasing foreign capital investment, establishing foreign currency stores, in U.S. dollars, and boosting agricultural production through state-controlled agricultural markets. To avoid monetary conflicts, the use of the convertible peso, CUC, was expanded, becoming the primary currency in non-national currency stores. The number of industries and overall economic production has increased, though significant challenges remain. The sugar industry, once a major source of foreign exchange, is now the third most important sector, after tourism and the nickel industry. While macroeconomic indicators have improved, many Cuban families still earn less than the basic purchasing power needed for an adequate diet. This shortfall is partially mitigated by the ration card system, and some basic needs are met through small private businesses allowed on the island, which improve per capita income. The most affected are families with lower levels of education or elderly individuals living alone for various reasons. Social inequalities have grown due to income disparities between state employees, the majority of the population, and self-employed workers, who in some cases can earn in a day what an average Cuban worker makes in a month. Low productivity and investments in education and healthcare mean that public spending on wages does not satisfy most of the population. As a result, part of the population engages in various illegal activities, ranging from unlicensed self-employment to black market sales of non-essential goods at exorbitant prices, and even unscrupulous trading of basic necessities like food and medicines, often of dubious origin. There is evident neglect of agricultural production, with most workers employed in the vast bureaucratic apparatus or service sectors. Another group with above-average income includes artists, scientists, and athletes. The wage problem in Cuba has led many young people to abandon formal work for independent businesses, emigrate, or rely on remittances. Since 2008, the government has encouraged the population to improve efficiency and productivity and plans to restructure wages based on performance, a reform that has yet to be fully felt in the country. This is a response to the evident egalitarianism that had minimized wage differences, such as between doctors and janitors. Emigration and social changes. As occurred in all communist countries, especially after World War II, the Cuban government restricted citizens' ability to emigrate, with strict regulations aimed at preventing the brain drain of highly educated professionals. This has caused widespread discontent, often denounced in international forums as a human rights violation. It has also led to a social phenomenon where people seek legal emigration through marriage with foreigners or employment abroad while maintaining ties to the Cuban state. In recent years, with the resurgence of leftist movements in Latin America, the Cuban Revolution has increased its leadership and support role, which had nearly disappeared in the 1990s. Currently, Cuba maintains strong relations, economic, political, military, and social, with Nicolas Maduro's government in Venezuela, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Cristina Fernández de Kirchner in Argentina, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, and Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua. In 2006, Fidel Castro fell ill and transferred power to his brother Raúl for the first time in 47 years since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in 1959. This event reopened extensive debates and speculation about the revolution's future. On February 19, 2008, Fidel Castro announced his definitive resignation from the presidency of Cuba through the official newspaper Granma, having provisionally stepped down on July 31, 2006, declining to seek the position again. The Cuban National Assembly elected Raúl Castro as the new president of Cuba on February 24, 2008. Dissidents and exiles. Since the era of expropriations and nationalizations, over 1.5 5 million Cubans have emigrated from Cuba, with the majority settling in South Florida, Miami, Hialeah, and New Jersey, while others chose Spain and Venezuela. Small Cuban communities also exist in many other parts of the world. The deteriorating living conditions in Cuba led to the 1994 migration crisis, known as the Rafter Crisis. According to some sources, these mass emigration events have called into question the Cuban government's credibility and its acceptance by the majority of the population. Cuba has argued that emigration to the United States is encouraged by the Cuban Adjustment Act, 1966, which allows any Cuban who sets foot on U.S. soil to automatically receive federal aid and become a legal resident after 1 year, unlike other Latin American immigrants. The Cuban government has labeled this policy a killer law because it encourages people to attempt the dangerous crossing of the Florida Straits without minimal safety conditions, leading to the loss of many lives. The case of the young boy Elian Gonzalez is a notable example of this tragedy. Cuban exile groups, especially in Florida, and some residents within Cuba, have formed opposition groups against the Cuban government. In contrast, the Cuban government accuses these groups of being mercenaries of U.S. imperialism and implicitly traitors to the homeland. In Cuban media, counter-revolutionaries based in Miami are often referred to as the Miami terrorist mafia, especially those connected with Cuban-American politicians who openly opposed the Cuban regime. The Ladies in White. The Ladies in White, Damas de Blanco, is a Cuban civic movement composed of wives and other relatives of Cuban prisoners, generally considered political prisoners, although the government of Fidel and Raúl Castro and their supporters consider them common criminals. According to the movement and its supporters, they denounce the existence of democratic activists imprisoned solely for being dissidents of the Castro brothers' dictatorship, Fidel and Raúl Castro. Conversely, their critics claim that they are merely a political tool of U.S. imperialism, and that the prisoners are incarcerated for espionage and proven connections with the CIA after having undergone judicial processes. They organize demonstrations in defense of political prisoners' rights on the island, carrying portraits of their incarcerated relatives and dressed in white. They attend Mass before gathering. Among their members are Laura Paulin Toledo, deceased, Berta Soler, Dolia Leal Francisco, Julia Núñez, Alejandrina Garcia de la Riva, Gloria Amaya Gonzalez, Milka Maria Pena, Melba Santana Arizona, Clara Lourdes Prieto, Yolanda Vera Neri, and Gisela Sanchez Verdisha. The movement emerged in 2003 following Cuba's Black Spring. It brings together the wives and mothers of 75 individuals, including some well-known figures, who were sentenced in March of that year to up to 28 years in prison for crimes against the state and undermining the principles of the revolution, among other judicial accusations. The group has received both support and criticism internationally. On March 29, 2010, demonstrations in support of the Ladies in White were held in Los Angeles, New York, Miami, and Madrid, led by Cuban figures such as Andy Garcia, Gloria Estefan, and Luis Posada Carriles. Recently, the Ladies in White were featured in a documentary by the Human Rights Foundation about their struggle in Cuba. Distinctions and recognitions. Julia, a member of the Ladies in White, a dissident group that emerged during the Black Spring. In April 2004, the European Parliament passed a resolution supporting the political prisoners, calling for their release and declaring that their imprisonment violates the most basic human rights, especially freedom of expression and political association. The resolution also urged the Cuban government to provide significant signs of progress toward full respect for fundamental freedoms, particularly freedom of expression and political association. The Council of Ministers of the European Union also issued a public statement condemning Cuba's actions as deplorable. Additionally, the movement received the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought from the European Parliament in 2005, recognizing their work in the field of human rights. However, they were unable to attend the award ceremony as the Cuban government denied all representatives permission to leave the country. In February 2006, the European Parliament passed another resolution supporting the Ladies in White. They also received the Pedro Luis Boydell Freedom Award in 2005. In October 2006, they were granted the Human Rights First Award from an NGO based in New York. Again, the Cuban government denied them exit permits to attend the award ceremony. Criticism. The ladies in white are frequently criticized and discredited by the Cuban government, which considers them mercenaries, funded by the U.S. interest section in Havana. They have also faced acts of repudiation from pro-government organizations, such as the Federation of Cuban Women. International support. In March 2010, a march in support of the group was held in Miami, organized by Cuban exiles and featuring Cuban artists like Gloria Estefan, Willie Chirino, Olga Guillo, Albita Rodriguez, and Amaury Gutierrez. Colombian singer Juanes also expressed his support on Twitter, and Colombian artist Shakira commented on the march. Today I join the call made by Gloria Estefan in support of the ladies in white, true heroines of our time, symbols of female courage and victims of repression and human rights violations in Cuba. Source, Wikipedia. Cuban Anatomy by Oscar Pena. If an honest political autopsy were conducted to determine the cause of the Republic of Cuba's death in 1959, the verdict would be, death caused by its own nationals. It wasn't a sudden death. We Cubans had been killing Cuba since its birth. Fulgencio Batista and Fidel Castro did not come from another planet. Cuban society gave birth to and raised them. From the first government in our history to today, in political matters, we do 2 things right and 10 wrong. Our problems, past and present, have not been caused by foreign powers, as is often claimed in Havana and by some in Miami. Those who assert this are merely justifying our shortcomings and lack of civic responsibility. Since our beginnings, harsh words and intransigence have been deeply rooted in Cuban politics. Adversaries were seen as enemies. Although Cuban politics displayed a range of options, interactions among them were not based on a genuine culture of dialogue and commitment to existing democratic structures. There was no political education among Cubans when, with bombs, gunfire, and death, they reacted to President Gerardo Machado's desire to remain in power. The opposition's reaction was worse than the president's actions. You cannot seriously build a country where its heroes are always those with pistols at their waists and pockets full of explosives. Machado left in 1933, and Cuba never achieved national tranquility. Who dares deny that the thriving Cuba before 1959 was a country experiencing rapid economic growth with one of the highest living standards in Latin America? Even with some areas of poverty and unemployment, Cuba did not deserve what its own people did to it. It was Cubans who, during the authentic governments of the 1940s and 1950s, practiced alarming levels of state corruption and enabled gangsterism. It was Cubans who, through radio, TV, and print media, exaggerated the issues and heavily polluted the political climate. Instead of providing dispassionate and impartial information or fostering democratic engagement, journalists engaged in political opposition. Specifically, radio criticism was not constructive for the country. It was also Cubans who disrespected the Constitution and democracy by staging a coup in 1952. It was Cubans who brutalized and murdered people in the streets of Cuba. It was Cubans who incited violence as the only method against the usurper Fulgencio Batista. And it was Cubans who, starting in 1959, committed crimes worse than those before. If there was ever a country in Latin America where a radical revolution was unnecessary, that country was Cuba. I firmly believe that for the new Cuba to emerge tomorrow as a nation with credentials, Cubans must bravely identify and acknowledge where we failed, what led one of the top 3 Latin American countries in the 1950s to be turned upside down by its own people. My point is that we have been, and still are, superficial people. I say this with sadness and do not exclude myself. How can we reconcile with those who rose in the mountains and fought in the cities against Fulgencio Batista, only to have to do the same against Fidel Castro just a few months later? More than a betrayed revolution, as often claimed, it's something more serious, superficiality. I don't just judge others, I also judge my own generation, those of us who emerged after 1959. How do we understand ourselves? Yesterday we admired or respected Fidel Castro, and today we are outside the country, or on a list to leave, or seeking an invitation or marriage to escape Cuba. Cuba doesn't interest me, many proclaim, wanting to be more American than Abraham Lincoln. That's not serious either. Have experiences and hardships taught us anything? No. Twice no. Our heroes and leaders are still the ones who shout the loudest and stir the most passion, still those who embrace violence and intransigence. We still fail to think critically for ourselves and wait for guidance from others. We do not intelligently support Cuban reformists within the government, who will be key to the transition. Despite all our flaws, I am very proud to be Cuban, and mentally, I have never stepped off the airplane that brought me from Cuba. On both shores, we must look up and bury intolerance. The patriotic and necessary inquiry today is: are we aware of our failures? Will we have the courage to admit and overcome them? Are we willing to change our political anatomy and grow as citizens? Are we prepared for the national transition and reconciliation that is inevitable due to biological realities? Do we understand that we have the responsibility to stabilize the country, not further destabilize it with erratic behavior? Do we realize that for the new Cuba to be truly free, democratic, and cultured, it must include both the relatives of Fulgencio Batista's officials and those of Fidel Castro? In the new Cuba, the sun must rise for everyone. Summary: Milco Baute. Many people wonder why Cubans haven't done anything to change their situation, why they haven't fought, revolted, or staged another revolution to overthrow the communist regime, as was the case with dictator Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, who was arrested and executed alongside his wife in 1989, ending a bloody 22-year communist era in that country, or more recently with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who was publicly lynched in 2011 after a 42-year dictatorship, or, in a less tragic outcome, Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, who ruled for 30 years before being forced to resign. A case closer to us is that of Manuel Zelaya in Honduras, who was ousted by the military and exiled from the country in 2009 after just 3 years in power before he could become a dictator. Cubans are even compared to Venezuelans and Nicaraguans, who have been fighting and taking to the streets in massive protests for years but have still not been able to rid themselves of their oppressors, resulting in countless civilian and ex-military deaths. There are many such cases throughout history where united people fighting in the streets have managed to overthrow their tyrants. The first thing to highlight is that in Ceausescu's case, he was executed by the military. His arrest, trial, and execution were carried out from within his own ranks, although the people were in the streets demanding justice. The difference with Cuba is that no military officials are willing to act either by force or by law because, in Cuba, there is no law other than that of the Castros and their ruthless military. The military and ex-military who opposed and rebelled early on were all murdered, disappeared, or executed. Castro even got rid of those who overshadowed him, like Commander Camilo Cienfuegos and Che Guevara himself, who, according to some sources, was captured after Castro provided his coordinates to the Bolivian army in 1967. Since the beginning of Castro's revolution in power, he ordered the confiscation of all civilian firearms. Only the military and police had weapons. If a rifle was lost, the person responsible would face a lengthy prison sentence, and a single rifle isn't enough to wage war, so no one would risk it. Although some Cubans have dared to make homemade firearms, these weapons are not long-range nor as lethal as rifles. The revolutionary era of machetes was long ago when firearms had limited range, allowing Cuban mombases on horseback to charge against the Spanish army in what was called the machete charge, inflicting heavy damage and casualties, ultimately helping Cuba achieve independence from Spanish rule in the late 19th century. In the cases of dictators like Gaddafi in Libya and probably Mubarak in Egypt, there was indirect intervention from other governments and powers like the U.S., which helped orchestrate their downfall because they didn't align with the globalist elite's agenda to govern the world. Specifically, Gaddafi, who refused to be part of globalism and globalization plans for establishing the New World Order, was a strong critic of this agenda. In 2009, he publicly denounced the New World Order at the United Nations. At the time, Barack Obama was U.S. president, complicit in and a promoter of Gaddafi's fall in 2011. Something similar happened with Jean-Claude Duvalier in Haiti in 1986, who was removed from power with U.S. support for the rebels. Likewise, Manuel Noriega in Panama was arrested following a U.S. military intervention, sentenced to 40 years in prison, and died of a brain tumor in 2017 at the age of 83 before completing his sentence. In Cuba's case, although a U.S. military intervention was planned in 1961, after Cuban exiles were trained on American soil to invade through Playa Girón in the Bay of Pigs, the mission was never completed and turned into a failure for the Cubans because they did not receive support from the Kennedy administration. Kennedy preferred to negotiate with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev rather than intervene militarily in Cuba, agreeing to withdraw nuclear missiles from the island. That was the only concrete and closest opportunity the Cuban people had to free themselves from the communist tyrant. There has been no way to achieve this from within the country in over 6 decades. The Alzados del Escambre, a group of rebels who took up arms against Castro early in the Communist Revolution, couldn't prevail against a heavily armed military supported and protected by the Soviets. The Cuban recruits or mercenaries who landed at Playa Girón, despite their willpower and trust in the U.S. government to support their fight, also couldn't defeat Castro's army. Isolated uprisings by dissident leaders, Cuban military personnel, and civilians over these 60 years of dictatorship have failed to change the country's fate because they lacked military assistance or even moral support from abroad. Over time, the world has turned a blind eye, abandoned the Cuban opposition struggle, and ignored dissidents who lack resources or means to fight peacefully, organize, protest, or raise awareness to discourage the population from participating in or supporting the regime. Cuba is a completely isolated island. The population is disarmed, misinformed, and, in many cases, malnourished, since the dictatorship uses hunger as a strategy for control and domination. They have ultimately created their new revolutionary man, who believes that things must be earned not through hard work or self-improvement but by committing to the regime in one way or another. People only think about what to eat today, what to wear, where to go, music, drinking, and entertainment, not about freedom, personal independence, goals, or new directions. They live imprisoned on an island, controlled and monitored like in a prison, restricted and deceived so they don't think about organizing, grouping together, protesting, or rising against their oppressor. There have been popular uprisings, but they aren't reported because the news is controlled by the Cuban regime. Moreover, these uprisings haven't been massive, but rather isolated, and eventually suppressed by force. However, Castro's government has been cunning, orchestrating mass exodus approximately every 15 years, allowing thousands of Cubans to leave the island by sea or through third countries, primarily heading to the U.S., especially South Florida. In the 1960s, Castro orchestrated a massive expulsion of Cubans. In 1980, he opened the port of Mariel for any Cuban who wanted to leave aboard boats sent by their relatives from the U.S. In 1994, he opened the coasts again for disaffected and discontented citizens to leave on any kind of vessel, once again relieving internal pressure. Since the 2000s, particularly during the Obama era, Castro's strategy for provoking mass emigration or a new exodus has been through Ecuador and Nicaragua. Thousands of Cubans managed to leave for these countries, funded by relatives in the U.S., to reach the southern U.S. border with Mexico. For a long time, U.S. Democrats played along with Castro's game because one reason the Democratic Party promotes open borders and mass immigration is to gain voters. However, this has started to change because Cubans, based on their experiences, generally register as Republicans when they become U.S. citizens, which doesn't benefit the Democratic Party. As we know, this is how the left operates, disguising and deceiving in any country worldwide. That's why the Cuban Adjustment Act for political asylum has changed, and now, Cubans who migrate to the U.S. without visas through official checkpoints are considered just another group of illegal immigrants. Yes, Cuba has had its eras, its opportunities, its possibilities, but unfortunately, it has never managed to achieve victory over that totalitarian regime that has ruled like a pharaoh for 60 years, from 1959 to the present. Sadly, the world has turned its back on us, especially in this globalist era, because the global elite benefits from having communist and religious dictatorships to maintain greater control over the global population. Perhaps this is why Venezuelans and Nicaraguans haven't been able to rid themselves of their tyrants either. Meanwhile, human rights organizations and major powers see the Cuban people's passivity, both inside and outside the country, a passivity that has persisted since the 1990s, and the population's complacency toward the dictatorship. How many more years do we have left? We cannot know, but I believe that God can change our destiny and misfortune if we seek Him with faith and constant prayer. Unfortunately, passivity and complacency are killing that hope because even the church and its leaders in Cuba appear resigned and content. We have been harshly punished for our past actions and mistakes, but more so for the abominations we've committed, turning our backs on the Creator, worshipping and idolizing men, false gods, idols, paganism, ancestral traditions, ignorance, immorality, and political illiteracy. I can't say if we have 10 more years to reach 70 years of trial, and if God has so willed it, He may have mercy and shorten that time. History has shown us how emperors, kings, and dictators, cruel and ruthless for many years, have met their end, their downfall, and judgment. Some have died in power, others have been judged and condemned, but the end always comes. For many years, Cubans talked about Fidel Castro's fall, and finally, Fidel fell, he publicly collapsed, breaking his knees. I don't know if it was because we spoke it into existence or because we wanted it so strongly, but that marked the beginning of his end. His fall from power took shape, bringing some relief to Cubans on the island because Fidel could no longer control everything. Gradually, his successor and brother Raúl loosened the reins, allowing some flexibility and freedoms that Cubans didn't have before. Cubans on the island could now access the internet, buy cell phones, have mobile lines, travel with fewer restrictions, and enjoy other small crumbs like self-employment businesses, buying cars, etc. Fidel fell, but nothing changed. Fidel died, but the tyrannical regime remains because Cuba's problem isn't just one man, it's a political regime, an ideology, and a culture of hatred, control, division, and oppression. Cuba's problem is the Cuban people, their complacency, double standards, indifference, and complicity, which are, in fact, the majority. The minority who think about freedom prefer to emigrate or escape because you can't fight against chaos and willful ignorance. Dissidents have no voice because Cuba is isolated and virtually cut off from the world, and no one cares anymore about the suffering of its people. I would rather be a foreigner in other lands than in my own. José Martí. If you believe that the suffering of Cubans is the greatest because of the long period we have had to endure, I will tell you that it is nothing compared to the suffering of the Jewish people throughout history. We are neither more nor less, but Israel is God's chosen people and has managed to avoid contamination from paganism and syncretism. Although many deny Jesus as the Messiah, they have had to endure not only tyrannical governments, invasions, and exiles but also the Nazi annihilation of their race and the destruction of their land. However, today it is the most prosperous and flourishing country in the Middle East, despite being surrounded by religious enemies who hate them and want to wipe them out. They have moved forward, progressed, triumphed, and multiplied because they have depended on their God, who protects and lifts them after trials. Socialism is a utopia. A utopia is something that seems beautiful but is improbable. Capitalism is real because it is the only functional economic and social system, as it is based on individual freedom. Capitalism offers three basic freedoms: freedom of speech, economic freedom, and spiritual freedom. While capitalism rewards effort, socialism rewards loyalty. In capitalism, the individual can control the state, backed by the Constitution. In socialism, the state controls the individual, whether they like it or not, and the Constitution is merely a worthless document. Historically, capitalism was created to replace feudalism, a model of slavery, control, and state abuse. Socialism was created to recover that tyrannical model of slavery, power, and control, but with humanistic ideas. As for fascism, this model was a socialist idea fused with capitalism, based on a free market economy and private property, but always under state control. In fact, theoretically, fascism was a better idea, but a psychopath named Hitler, who was financed and elevated to power by economic powers that have always dreamed of a global political, economic, and religious empire, created a new version and variant of fascism called Nazi fascism. This version was more aggressive, violent, and militarized, far from the original idea of the European progressives of the late 19th century. But as José Martí said, be cultured to be free. The mind is cultivated through reading, but many people love living in ignorance and continue to believe everything socialism offers because it sounds nice and fair. Many people love lies, consciously or unconsciously, and want to live off the state or have the state manage their lives because they are too foolish to manage it themselves. The fundamental weapon used by socialism, or any leftist ideology, is the lie, spread through propaganda. That's why they manage to deceive the uneducated and ignorant, who are the ones that bring them to power, only to complain later when they could have prevented it. The worst part is that after realizing the lies and abuses of power by their socialist rulers, they have no choice but to emigrate to a capitalist country because they don't even dare to fight for their independence. And to make matters worse, they end up voting for another politician with socialist ideas in the country they emigrated to, putting capitalism in check and harming all of us who think critically, those of us who are educated, intellectuals, who have dignity, independent opinions, free thinkers, brilliant and less brilliant minds, entrepreneurs, prosperous individuals, spiritual people, free citizens who enjoy democracy, know their constitution, respect it, and protect it, who live according to law and order, and all those who use reason. In the world, there are many skulls but few brains. Famous political quotes. Between a government that does wrong and a people who allow it, there is a certain shameful complicity. Victor Hugo. Weak and feeble-minded people, without will or conscience, are those who take pleasure in being poorly governed. Jacinto Benavente. If there is an idiot in power, it's because those who elected him are well represented. Mahatma Gandhi. An imperceptible government, a happy people; an overbearing government, a miserable people. Lao Tzu. Make the people believe they govern, and they will let themselves be governed. William Penn. Democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Abraham Lincoln. Dictatorship is the system of government where what is not forbidden is mandatory. Enrique Jardiel Poncila. Dictatorship is not avoided by denouncing it but by making it unnecessary through rigorous discipline and duty. Gregorio Marañón. The strength of those who govern is truly nothing more than the strength of those who allow themselves to be governed. Guillaume T. Reynaud. The reason of state should not oppose the state of reason. Charles V. The problem with a country where the government is weak is not the strength of the opposition but the memory of the electorate. Anonymous. Statesmen are like surgeons, their mistakes are fatal. François Mauriac. A bad ruler squeezes the people, giving little in return. Thomas B. Macaulay. Nothing is sadder than the spectacle of a country that endures a detested government out of fear. André Maurois. No government can remain secure for long without formidable opposition. Benjamin Disraeli. No people truly believe in their government. At best, they are resigned to it. Octavio Paz. One should have neither love nor hate for those in government. They should be regarded as coaches, they either drive well or poorly, that's all. Alfred de Vigny. For the afflicted vassal, it makes no difference whether the government errs out of malice or ignorance. Francisco Manuel de Mello. For an unjust government, a martyr is more dangerous than a rebel. Massimo T. D'Azeglio. Let others argue about forms of government. The one that governs best is the one that administers best. Alexander Pope. Whoever does not know how to govern is always a usurper. Carlo Bini. If a people have the government they deserve, when will we deserve to have none? Paul Jean Toulette. A state is well governed when citizens obey the magistrates, and the magistrates obey the laws. Solon. A country ruled by a despot is an inverted cone. Samuel Johnson. A dictatorship is a state where everyone fears one, and one fears everyone. Alberto Moravia. A dictatorship is a regime where people recite instead of think. Ignazio Siloni. The end of the book. Book created by Baute Production in Tampa, Florida, United States of America. Phone, 813-693-8879. The author's biography. Milco Baute Lopez, a Cuban writer, editor, and educator of international acclaim, has woven a fascinating trajectory over the decades. His pen, infused with passion and creativity, has been a beacon of knowledge and artistic expression since 1992 when he began enlightening the world with his insightful articles. The most significant chapter of his life was written on December 10, 1995, when Milco crossed borders and oceans to settle in the United States. This land of opportunities became his new home, and in 2001, with a profound sense of belonging, he embraced U.S. citizenship, merging his Cuban roots with his love for cultural diversity. The pursuit of knowledge and wisdom has always been a constant in Milco's life. This passionate autodidact, eager to nourish his intellect, embarked on a remarkable academic journey. He studied philosophy through an online course offered by the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and in 2016, he successfully completed his academic journey, becoming a graduate of this venerable institution. Milco Baute is not only an accomplished writer but also a prolific author. From 2008 to the present, he has given life to more than 100 books, showcasing his literary talent in both English and Spanish. In addition to his personal work, Milco plays a pivotal role in the publishing industry as an editor, writer, and distributor, collaborating with other authors to bring their stories to the world. One cannot fully grasp the rich palette of Milco's experiences without mentioning his technical background as a graduate in Cuba in 1986 as a technician in electrical power systems. This distinguished profession led him to practice his craft with skill for over 2 decades before his passion for writing and education led him down new paths. In summary, the life of Milco Baute Lopez is a symphony of creativity, perseverance, and dedication. His journey from the Cuban shores to the borders of the United States, through academic exploration and prolific literary production, is a testament to his unwavering spirit and commitment to cultural enrichment and knowledge in all its forms.